September 9th AD, deep in the heart of Germania, 3 Roman legions, over 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, marched confidently into the darkness of an ancient forest. They were the pride of Emperor Augustus, veterans of countless campaigns, armed with the best weapons, the best armour, the best training the ancient world had ever seen. They trusted their guide, a Germanic prince who wore Roman armour and spoke perfect Latin, a man they called friend, a man they called ally. They believed in their invincibility. They believed Germania was conquered. They believed nothing could stop the Roman war machine. They were wrong. In 3 days of unrelenting horror, the forest would become their tomb. Almost none of them would leave alive. This is the story of the greatest betrayal in military history. The day a trusted advisor became Rome's deadliest enemy. The day 3 entire legions vanished from existence. The day Rome learned that even empires can bleed. Before we march into this brutal story of deception and annihilation, ensure you're subscribed with notifications on. We're dedicated to bringing you the raw, unvarnished truth of history's turning points, and you won't want to miss the deep dives coming next. If you value these detailed breakdowns of military catastrophes, please like the video right now. It helps the algorithm share this history with others. Now let's witness how the nightmare unfolded. The year is 9 AD, and Rome stands at the peak of its power. The legions have conquered Gaul, crushed Spain, and turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. Now Emperor Augustus has set his sights on Germania, the vast, untamed wilderness beyond the Rhine River. For 3 years, Roman governors have been transforming the fierce Germanic tribes into tax-paying subjects of the empire. Roads are being built, Roman law is being enforced, the conquest seems complete. But empires built on arrogance crumble from within, and in the forests of Germania, a plot is brewing that will shatter Rome's dreams of endless expansion forever. At the centre of this conspiracy stands one man, a Germanic prince who speaks perfect Latin, dines with Roman governors, and wears the uniform of a Roman officer. His name is Arminius, and he's about to orchestrate the most devastating ambush in ancient warfare. This isn't just a battle, it's a masterclass in deception, a story of how one man's cunning turned Rome's greatest strength, its trust in loyal allies, into its most fatal weakness. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest didn't just destroy 3 legions, it destroyed Rome's belief that Germania could ever be conquered. And it all began with a handshake and a lie. Publius Quinctilius Varus arrived in Germania in 7 AD with one mission: turn barbarians into Romans. He wasn't a military genius, he was an administrator, a politician, with connections to the imperial family through marriage. His previous posting had been Syria, where he'd grown wealthy, some said obscenely wealthy, taxing a pacified population. Syria had been easy. The people there understood what it meant to be conquered. They paid their taxes, followed Roman law, and didn't cause trouble. Germania would be different, but Varus didn't know it yet. To him, these Germanic tribes were no different from any other conquered people. They needed Roman civilization, they needed Roman order, and if they resisted, they needed Roman steel. He governed from summer camps, held court like a Roman magistrate, and imposed taxes on tribes that had never paid tribute to anyone. The Germanic chieftains who came to him with grievances were treated like petty criminals. Varus heard their cases, passed judgment, and collected his fees. He was transforming warriors into taxpayers. But Varus made one critical mistake. He trusted too easily. He believed that the Germanic elite who served Rome, the ones who'd been given Roman citizenship, who commanded auxiliary troops, who swore loyalty to the emperor, were truly Roman. He couldn't conceive that a man who'd eaten at Roman tables, fought in Roman wars, and received Roman honours might still hate Rome with every fibre of his being. That blindness would cost him everything. Arminius wasn't born a traitor. He was born a prince of the Cherusci tribe, one of the most powerful Germanic peoples. As a boy, probably around the age of 10, he'd been taken to Rome as a hostage, a common Roman practice to ensure tribal loyalty. But Rome didn't treat noble hostages like prisoners. They were educated, Romanized, and groomed to become allies. Arminius learned to speak Latin fluently. He studied Roman military tactics, Roman politics, and Roman weaknesses. He watched how the legions fought. He learned how Roman commanders thought. By the time he reached manhood, Arminius had become exactly what Rome wanted, a Romanized German. He served in the Roman auxiliary forces with distinction, commanding Cherusci cavalry units during the brutal wars in Pannonia. He earned Roman citizenship, a privilege granted to very few barbarians. He was awarded the rank of equestrian knight, a title that marked him as part of Rome's elite. To any Roman observer, Arminius was proof that the system worked. You could take a barbarian, educate him, and create a loyal Roman. But Arminius never forgot who he was. Beneath the Roman uniform and the Latin phrases, he remained a Cherusci prince, and when he returned to Germania around 7 AD to serve under Varus as a commander of auxiliary forces, he saw something that ignited his rage. His people being turned into slaves. The proud warriors of his tribe were being taxed into poverty. Their disputes were settled by arrogant Roman governors who knew nothing of Germanic honour. Their lands were being carved up for Roman roads and fortresses. Arminius made a decision. Rome had trained him to be a weapon. Now he would turn that weapon against his teachers. For 2 years, Arminius played the role of the perfect Roman ally. He advised Varus on Germanic affairs. He dined with the governor and his staff. He provided intelligence on which tribes were loyal and which might cause trouble. He even warned Varus about potential uprisings, always positioning himself as Rome's most reliable friend in hostile territory. Varus trusted him completely. Why wouldn't he? Arminius was living, proof of Roman superiority, a barbarian who'd seen the light of civilization. But behind the scenes, Arminius was waging a different war. In secret meetings deep in the forests, away from Roman eyes, he began approaching the leaders of other Germanic tribes. This was dangerous work. The Germanic peoples weren't a unified nation. They were dozens of distinct tribes, the Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Massi, the Chatti, and many of them hated each other as much as they hated Rome. Ancient feuds and blood rivalries ran deep. Convincing these proud, independent warriors to work together would require more than speeches. It would require a plan so audacious, so perfectly executed, that no tribe could resist joining. Arminius offered them that plan. He knew the Roman military machine better than any Germanic warrior alive. He knew the legion's strengths, discipline, organization, and devastating infantry tactics in open battle. But he also knew their weaknesses. Roman legions depended on formation fighting. They needed space to maneuver. Their heavy armour and equipment made them slow and vulnerable in difficult terrain. Their reliance on supply lines made long marches through hostile territory dangerous. And most importantly, Roman commanders were arrogant. They believed Germanic warriors were disorganized savages who would break and run at the first sight of disciplined Roman infantry. Arminius promised the tribal leader something unprecedented, a chance to destroy not just a Roman patrol but 3 entire legions, 17 to 20,000 soldiers, plus camp followers, perhaps 25,000 people in total. The scale of the ambush he was planning was breathtaking. Nothing like it had ever been attempted, but it would require perfect timing, perfect terrain, and perfect deception. Every tribe would have to commit warriors, every chieftain would have to follow the plan, and most importantly, Varus would have to be lured into the trap without suspecting anything. But the late summer of 9 AD, Arminius was ready. Varus and his 3 legions, the 17th Zestiar and Nisti, were preparing to move from their summer camp back to their winter quarters on the Rhine. It was supposed to be a routine march through pacified territory. The legions had spent the summer conducting administrative duties, building infrastructure and showing the flag. Now, as autumn approached and the weather began to turn, it was time to return to safer ground. That's when Arminius sprung his trap. He came to Varus with urgent news. A rebellion had broken out among a distant tribe. It wasn't a major uprising, he explained, just some unrest that needed to be dealt with quickly before it spread. The rebels were in an area off the main road deeper into the forest. If Varus could march his legions there and make a show of force, the rebellion would collapse immediately. It was exactly the kind of minor crisis that Roman governors dealt with constantly. A quick detour, a display of Roman power, and everything would return to normal. Varus never questioned it. Why would he? Arminius had never given him reason to doubt. Other Germanic allies serving with the Romans had no reason to suspect anything either. Arminius had been careful to keep his conspiracy limited to those outside Varus's immediate circle. One man did try to warn Varus. Segestes, a rival Germanic chieftain who had his own grudge against Arminius, came to the Roman governor with a desperate warning. Arminius is betraying you. He's leading you into an ambush. Arrest him now before it's too late. But Varus dismissed the warning. He believed it was nothing more than a personal rivalry between two Germanic nobles. These barbarians were always feuding with each other, he thought. Segestes was probably just trying to eliminate a rival by making false accusations. Arminius had proven his loyalty 100 times over. The governor would not punish his most trusted ally based on the word of a jealous chieftain. It was a fatal miscalculation. On September 9th, 9 AD, 3 Roman legions broke camp and followed Arminius into the forest. They marched in a long column stretched out for miles because the forest paths were narrow. They brought everything with them: baggage wagons, supply trains, camp followers, women, children, servants. It was an army on the move, confident and unsuspecting. The weather was turning worse, rain beginning to fall, making the narrow paths muddy and treacherous. Arminius rode at the front with Varus, guiding the column deeper into the dense woods. At some point during that first day, he quietly excused himself. He told Varus he needed to ride ahead and coordinate with allied tribal forces who would help suppress the rebellion. Varus agreed. He watched his trusted advisor disappear into the trees. Arminius never came back. He rode straight to the Germanic warriors waiting in the forest. The mask was off. The Roman was gone. The Cherusci prince had returned, and the slaughter was about to begin. If this story is giving you chills, it's because it shows how dangerous it is to be exposed when you don't know who is watching. But briefly, uncovering the details of these ancient campaigns often requires me to access digital archives and research from all over the world. I use NordVPN to do that securely. Unlike Varus, who walked blindly into a trap, NordVPN ensures my personal data is encrypted and my browsing is private. It is a tool I trust for digital safety. If you want to secure your online privacy and support the channel, check the link in the description or the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. Now drop a comment below. Do you think Varus could have escaped if he had listened to the warning? Let's talk about it. On September 9th, 9 AD. The Roman column stretched for nearly 20 kilometers through dense Germanic forest. This wasn't an army prepared for battle. This was an army on administrative movement. 3 full legions, the Sixtentivan, Zosti, and Niv, along with auxiliary units, camp followers, baggage wagons, supply trains, women, children, servants. Perhaps 25,000 people in total, snaking through narrow forest paths in a line so long that the front couldn't see the rear. The forest itself was a nightmare. Ancient Germania wasn't the orderly woodland of modern Europe. This was primeval forest, massive oaks and beech trees so thick their canopy blocked out the sun. The undergrowth was dense, tangled, impenetrable. The paths were narrow, barely wide enough for wagons, and then the weather turned. Rain began falling, light at first, then heavier. The paths turned to mud. The wagons began sinking. The column slowed to a crawl. That's when the Germans struck, not in one massive wave, but in small groups darting out of the forest. They came from the sides, from behind, from elevated ground the Romans couldn't reach. They hurled javelins and lead missiles into the packed column, and then vanished back into the trees before the Romans could respond. It was chaos. Roman soldiers tried to form defensive lines, but there was no space. The terrain was too broken, the forest too dense. The legion's greatest strength, its disciplined formation fighting, was completely useless. The Romans tried to use their standard tactics. The testudo formation, where soldiers lock their shields together to create a protective shell, was supposed to protect against missile fire. But the testudo was designed for siege warfare, for slow advances against enemy archers in open ground. Here, in the mud and rain, with attacks coming from all directions, the formation fell apart. Shields became too heavy, men slipped in the mud. The constant harassment never stopped. By nightfall of the first day, the column had been battered but not broken. Varus ordered the army to make camp, a standard Roman defensive measure. Even in hostile territory, legions were trained to build fortified camps every night. Earthen ramparts, wooden palisades, defensive ditches. It was back-breaking work, especially in the rain, but it kept the army safe. The Germans didn't attack the camp. Arminius was too smart for that. He knew that even demoralized Roman soldiers behind fortifications were deadly. Let them exhaust themselves building defenses. Tomorrow they would have to march again. Morning came with more rain. The Romans broke camp and continued marching, hoping to reach open ground where they could fight properly. Varus still believed they could push through. The column reformed and moved forward, but they were slower now. Casualties from the previous day meant fewer hands to push wagons out of the mud. Wounded men had to be carried or abandoned. The baggage train was holding everything up. The German attacks intensified. They had spent the night resting while the Romans dug trenches. Now, fresh and coordinated, they hit the column again and again. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was systematic destruction. Germanic warriors knew every path, every ravine, every piece of high ground. They attacked, withdrew, repositioned, and attacked again. The Romans couldn't catch them. Every time a unit tried to pursue the attackers into the forest, they disappeared or led the Romans into another ambush. Roman discipline began cracking. Legionaries were trained to fight in formation, shoulder to shoulder with their brothers. But in the forest, formations were impossible. Men fought as individuals, isolated and terrified. The auxiliary cavalry tried to break out and scout ahead, but the terrain was impossible for horses. Many were cut down by German warriors who used the trees for cover. Others got separated from the column and were hunted down. The Germans weren't just attacking, they were herding the Romans. Every ambush, every attack pushed the column in a specific direction. Arminius knew exactly where he wanted them to go. Ahead lay Calcrease, a narrow passage between a hill and a marsh. And there, the Germans had prepared something special. While Varus had been dining with Arminius weeks earlier, Germanic warriors had been building a turf rampart along that passage, 400 metres long, reinforced with drainage ditches and wooden palisades. It was a killing ground, carefully prepared in advance. By the second night, the Romans were exhausted. They'd marched all day under constant attack, in torrential rain, through impossible terrain. They built another fortified camp, but morale was collapsing. Officers were dying. Centurions, the backbone of Roman military discipline, were being picked off by German javelin throwers. Some soldiers were openly talking about abandoning the baggage and trying to fight their way to the Rhine. Varus refused. To abandon Roman standards, Roman equipment, would be to admit defeat. He still believed they could make it. The third day began with desperation. The column was disintegrating. Wounded men who couldn't walk were being left behind. Wagons were abandoned in the mud. The Romans were no longer marching. They were fleeing. And ahead lay the narrow passage at Calcrease. The Germans had funneled them exactly where they wanted them. The passage was a death trap. On one side was a hill covered with trees, on the other was a swamp. In between was a narrow sandbar path, barely wide enough for the column, and along the hill the Germans had built their rampart. As the Roman column entered the killing ground, thousands of Germanic warriors rose up behind the fortification and unleashed hell. Javelins, stones, and spears rained down on the trapped Romans from above. There was nowhere to run. The swamp blocked escape on one side. The hill was too steep to climb. The rampart blocked the path forward. The Romans tried to storm the rampart. Legionaries, even exhausted and demoralized, were still dangerous. They charged the German positions in small groups trying to break through, but they were attacking uphill through mud against prepared defences. The Germans had every advantage. They fought from behind wooden palisades, hurling missiles down onto the Romans below. When Roman soldiers got close, German warriors engaged them in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The short Roman gladius, deadly in formation fighting, was less effective in the chaos of individual melee. Germanic warriors wielded longer spatha swords and knew how to use terrain to their advantage. The slaughter was total. The Roman column collapsed into chaos. Units fragmented, officers fell. The standards, the sacred eagle standards that represented each legion's honour, were being overrun. Some commanders chose suicide over capture. The Roman prefect Aeonius surrendered at first, then killed himself in shame. His colleague Aegeus died leading a doomed charge. All around them, Roman soldiers were being cut down. Some begged for mercy, some fought to the last, none escaped. Publius Quinctilius Varus watched his world end. 3 legions, the army he'd been entrusted to command, were being massacred around him. The Germanic tribes he'd believed pacified had risen up under the leadership of the man he'd trusted most. His officers were dead. His standards were being captured. His men were being slaughtered or taken prisoner. There was no way out. The Rhine was still kilometres away through hostile territory. Even if he could escape, he would return to Rome as the man who lost 3 legions. Varus made the Roman choice. Following the example of his father and grandfather before him, men who had also faced disgrace and chosen death, he drew his sword and drove it into his own body. It was the approved manner of suicide for a Roman officer. Better to die by your own hand than be captured and paraded through enemy territory. Some of his subordinate officers followed his example. The command structure of 3 Roman legions committed suicide rather than face capture. But death didn't end Varus's humiliation. The Germans found his body and decapitated it. His head was sent to Maroboduus, a powerful Germanic king, as proof of the victory. Eventually it was returned and brought to Rome for burial, but the damage was done. The man who had entered Germania as a governor left it as a severed head, a trophy of Germanic triumph. By the end of the 3rd day, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was over. 15 to 20,000. Roman soldiers were dead. The battlefield was a charnel house of shattered bodies, broken equipment, and butchered horses. The 3 sacred eagle standards, the aquili of the 17th, 16th, and 19th legions, had been captured, the greatest shame that could befall a Roman legion. A few survivors escaped into the forest and eventually made it back to Roman territory. Others were taken prisoner. Their fate would be worse than death. The killing was over, but the horror had just begun. Approximately 1,500 Roman prisoners stood on the muddy battlefield, hands bound, surrounded by Germanic warriors still drunk on victory. These weren't common soldiers being offered terms of surrender. This was something far more ancient, far more terrifying. The Germanic tribes practiced ritual sacrifice to their gods, and a victory of this magnitude demanded an unprecedented offering. The prisoners were herded to sacred sites throughout the forest, rectangular stone enclosures that served as open-air temples, and marshes that the Germanic peoples believed connected the mortal world to the divine. The sacrifices began at dawn. Roman officers were singled out first. Some had their throats cut over altars, their blood spilling onto sacred ground. Others were killed in other brutal ritual ways, their bodies offered up to the gods. The Romans who watched and waited knew their turn was coming. The most horrific treatment was reserved for the highest-ranking captives. Germanic warriors beheaded them, then nailed their severed heads to trees using foot-long iron spikes driven through the eye sockets. The forest became a gallery of death. Roman faces frozen in their final agony, mounted on tree trunks like trophies. It was psychological warfare as much as religious ritual. Each new group of prisoners dragged past these displays became paralyzed with terror. Some broke down completely. Others prayed to Roman gods who seemed to have abandoned them. The lucky ones, if they could be called that, were sold into slavery. Germanic warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle claimed Roman prisoners as property. These men would spend the rest of their lives in bondage, living reminders of the day Rome's invincibility died. A few, a very few, managed to escape over the years and make their way back to Roman territory. They brought with them stories that would haunt Rome for generations. The Teutoburg Forest wasn't just a military defeat. It was a descent into nightmare. The news reached Rome weeks later. Emperor Augustus was 72 years old, the undisputed master of the Roman world for over 40 years. He had transformed Rome from a republic torn by civil war into an empire that stretched from Spain to Egypt. He had won battles, crushed rivals, and built a system of government that seemed eternal. And now, in the twilight of his reign, he received the worst military news any Roman emperor had ever heard. 3 legions annihilated, their standards captured, their commander dead. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Augustus's reaction was visceral and devastating. He let his hair and beard grow untrimmed for months, a sign of mourning reserved for the greatest personal tragedies. He would pace the marble halls of his palace and slam his head against the doors in anguish. And repeatedly, obsessively, he would cry out the same desperate phrase, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." It became a haunted refrain echoing through the imperial residence, "Give me back my legions," as if shouting could undo the massacre, as if rage could resurrect the dead. The defeat shattered Augustus's final ambitions. For years he had dreamed of extending Rome's borders to the Elbe River, creating a province of Germania that would match Gaul in wealth and strategic importance. Now that dream was dead. 3 legions, the 17th Austiat and 19th, had been erased from existence. Their eagle standards, the sacred aquelae that represented Rome's honour and martial spirit, were in barbarian hands. It was a humiliation that cut deeper than any military loss. Those eagles weren't just banners, they were semi-divine objects, blessed by priests, revered by soldiers. Losing them was like losing Rome's soul. Augustus took immediate action to prevent further disaster. He fortified the Rhine frontier with additional troops. He recalled veterans to emergency service. He even conducted a levy by lot in Rome itself, something that hadn't been done in living memory, because so few volunteers came forward. The paranoia ran deep. There were rumours that Arminius might march on Gaul, that the Germanic tribes might cross the Rhine in force. Augustus stationed guards throughout Rome to prevent riots. The invincible empire had learned it could be wounded, and that knowledge spread like poison through the system. Rome never forgot Teutoburg, and it never forgave. In 14 AD, Augustus died, and his successor Tiberius inherited an empire still reeling from the disaster. Tiberius appointed his nephew Germanicus to lead a massive revenge campaign into Germania. For 3 years, from 14 to 16 AD, Roman legions crossed the Rhine with one mission: punish the tribes and recover the lost eagles. Germanicus was brilliant and ruthless. He burned villages, slaughtered warriors, and in 15 AD, he even found the battlefield of Teutoburg Forest. The site was a mass grave. 6 years after the battle, the bones of 20,000 Romans still lay scattered through the forest. Skulls were nailed to trees. Equipment was half buried in the mud. The long turf rampart the Germans had built still stood, a monument to Roman defeat. Germanicus ordered his soldiers to bury the remains, and then he pressed on. Over the course of his campaigns, he recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards, the aquilae of the 16th and 17th legions. The 3rd eagle, belonging to the 16th legion, wouldn't be recovered until the reign of Emperor Claudius decades later, around 41 AD. But revenge wasn't conquest. Germanicus won battles, but he couldn't hold territory. The Germanic tribes melted into the forests, regrouped and struck back. The campaigns were bleeding Rome's treasury dry. Arminius, though defeated in open battle, remained alive and dangerous. In 16 AD, Tiberius recalled Germanicus. The emperor had made a strategic decision that would define Europe for the next 4 centuries. Rome would not conquer Germania. The Rhine and Danube rivers would become the permanent frontier of the empire. The Limes Germanicus, the Germanic frontier, stretched for 550 kilometres from the North Sea to the Danube. It consisted of fortified watchtowers, garrison forts, and eventually a wooden palisade backed by earthen ramparts. This wasn't a wall meant to keep everyone out, like Hadrian's Wall in Britain. It was a controlled border for managing trade, taxing goods, and monitoring movement. But symbolically, it represented something profound, the limit of Roman power. Beyond the Rhine lay free Germania, unconquered and unconquerable. The 3 legions destroyed at Teutoburg Forest were never reconstituted. Their numbers, 17, Exhaustion, and Annihilated, were never used again in Roman military history. It was unprecedented. Roman legions had been destroyed before, but they were always rebuilt, their numbers recycled, their honour restored. Not this time. The annihilation was so complete, the shame so deep, that Rome couldn't even speak those numbers again. They became ghosts haunting the imperial military system. The battle created a permanent division in Europe. West of the Rhine, Roman culture took root. Latin evolved into French, Spanish, and Italian. Roman law shaped legal systems. Christianity spread through Roman infrastructure. East of the Rhine, Germanic culture remained dominant. The tribes eventually formed kingdoms, the Franks, the Saxons, the Goths, that would inherit Europe after Rome fell. The linguistic and cultural border between Romance and Germanic Europe, visible even today, has its roots in that muddy forest in 9 AD. Arminius himself didn't live to see his full legacy. He had united the tribes for one brilliant moment, but that unity didn't last. The Germanic peoples returned to their ancient rivalries and feuds. In 21 AD, just 12 years after his greatest triumph, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own family who feared he was becoming too powerful. He died at 38, murdered by the same tribal politics he had briefly transcended. But his name lived on. Centuries later, Germanic peoples would remember him as a founding hero, the man who proved that Rome could be stopped. Rome's expansion died in the Teutoburg Forest. For 3 days in September 9th AD, the Roman war machine, disciplined, professional, seemingly unstoppable, was torn apart by warriors fighting on their own ground, using their own tactics, led by a man who knew Rome's weaknesses better than Rome knew itself. 20,000 soldiers marched into that forest. Only a small fraction ever made it out alive, and many of those survivors were broken men who had fled into the woods or been enslaved. It was betrayal, tactical genius, and catastrophic arrogance all converging in one place at one time. And when it was over, the course of European history had changed forever. This is the brutal truth they don't teach you in school. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest wasn't just another ancient battle. It was the day an empire learned its limits. 3 legions gone, 20,000 dead, and a border that would define Europe for 400 years. Arminius proved that even Rome could bleed when you knew where to strike. If this analysis of Rome's greatest defeat fascinated you, you need to see what happens next. Click the video on your screen to watch the brutal Roman revenge campaigns that followed. But before you go, If you want to support the channel directly, you can buy me a coffee on Ko-fi, or check out the phalanx wall design and other historical gear in the store shelf right below the video. It is the best way to help us keep producing these documentaries. Thanks for watching Wars and History. This is the truth of warfare, and we'll see you in the next one.